To graph one period of a sine or cosine function that has been either moved up or down or reflected, we'll follow a very similar process to what we've done before. So if you need to go back and watch a previous video, that might be a good idea. So there's a few things I'm going to want to note before I start to make my sketch of the graph. First thing I want to know is the amplitude. That's still just the a value, so the amplitude of this graph is going to be 3. Okay. Also, I'll still want to know the period of the graph, so I can graph one period. Remember, that depends on what the b value is, and the b value is 4. That doesn't mean the period's 4, but it does help me find the period. The formula that we looked at in the previous video was to take 2 pi, the normal period, and divide it by the b value. 2 pi divided by 4 simplifies down to just pi over 2, so there's the new period. What's new about these graphs is that I might have a midline that's no longer located at the x-axis. That's what this number being added or subtracted to my graph will do. This will move, this minus 2 at the end, will move the entire graph down 2 spaces. And specifically, I may want to make a note that that's actually the midline that's been moved. Actually, everything's been moved, but it's going to be the midline that I'm going to focus on when I do this. Okay? One other thing I may want to note is whether the graph has been reflected or not. Since the a value is positive, this graph has not been reflected. It's going to follow the same pattern as a regular sine graph is going to follow. So there's all the notes I want to make. Let's go ahead and actually make a sketch then of one period of this graph. So it'll start off the same way where I kind of draw this as my axes. I'm just going to show one period of this graph when the graph is positive. What I'm going to do differently though is I'm going to start with drawing where my midline is. My midline has been moved down 2 spaces. So I'm going to make sure I label that on my graph, and I'm going to include a dashed line right there. That's going to be sort of my new center line where this wave is going to kind of alternate above and below. So it's no longer about the x-axis, it's all about that midline down there, okay? At the same time, I'm going to go ahead and finish labeling my y-axis scale using my amplitude. So from that midline, my graph is going to go up 3 spaces. So 1, 2, 3 is going to put me at 1, so I want to make sure that that point is labeled on my graph. It's also going to count down 3 from the midline, so 1, 2, 3, meaning -5 is going to be the lowest point this graph gets to. So I do want to see all those values labeled. As we've done before, it's just no longer centered at the x-axis. Okay. Next thing, let's go ahead and label our x-axis. Well, as far out as this graph's going to get to, it's going to be one period, which we said earlier was going to be pi over 2. So let me label this point pi over 2. Now, I'm going to label on the x-axis. Some people have found it easier to maybe label it on the midline. I don't care where you label it, but just make sure that point is labeled somewhere, okay? However, as before, I still want to see the middle of that, so I'll add a tick mark right there. I also want to see half of the halfway and that right there, as we've done in previous examples. So I've given you some shortcuts to find those if you want a quick refresher. We said to find those values, we're just dividing it up into 4 sections, but take the period times a fourth, take the period times a half, take the period times 3/4. That'll be sort of your shortcut way to get these values if you need help with them. So this value works out to be pi over 4, halfway. Half of that is pi over 8 for this tick mark right here. And then this 3/4 of the way tick mark is going to be 3 pi over 8. So make sure that every single one of those values is identified on your graph, or I'm not going to count it correct. All right, now to finish this one, let's plot our points. And remember, it's all about the midline this time, not about the x-axis. So since we were dealing with sine, I want to think back to how sine works. When sine begins, it begins from the midline. So I'm going to put a point right there on the midline. The next stop, my graph, my sine wave goes up. So I'm going to max out right there at the highest point. The next stop along the graph, I'm back to the midline. The next x value, we're down to the low amplitude, so the lowest, the minimum the graph gets to. And then at the end, my graph is going to start or stop where I started, back at the midline. So there are the 5 points. It's very, very similar to what we've done before, just no longer centered at the x-axis. So there's that wave. I'm going to extend it a little bit and add those arrows so that we can remember that this graph goes forever left and right. So there's one example. If you think you got it, you can go ahead and kind of fast forward to the next one. But let me go ahead and take a look at one more example for graphing a sine or cosine wave that's not centered at the x-axis. Okay, so once again, I'm going to start by identifying the parts I need to know about this graph. So this one that's being added to the function is going to move my graph up 1. And remember, that's specifically going to affect where my midline is located. It affects where everything's located, but specifically the midline is what I'm looking for. My amplitude is my coefficient of sine or cosine, so my amplitude is 4 this time. Remember, amplitude is always positive. I'll also want to know what the period of the graph is. The period is associated with the b value. It's connected to it. It's not that itself. The period is equal to 2 pi, the normal period for sine or cosine, divided by the b value. Well, this time the period works out to just be 1. Okay. One other thing I'm noting about this graph is that a value was negative, which means this graph is actually going to be reflected. And so when I go to plot the points, I need to make sure I'm kind of flipping things over the x-axis, flipping it over, of what a normal cosine graph would look like. So I have to take that into account as well when I graph this one. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look. So I'll start with my typical looking graph, just like so. But the first thing I want to add to that is where the midline is. Well, this time we said everything had been moved up 1. So my midline is now located at 1. And I'll include a dashed line to show where that is located. Okay? From there, let's use our amplitude to find out how high and how low the graph goes. Our amplitude was 4, so from your midline, let's count up 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And label that point, that would be then 5, okay? And then count down 4 as well, so 1, 2, 3, 4 would put me down at -3. So there's my y-axis identified with the highest and lowest values that my wave is going to get to. Okay, next up, let's figure out the period and identify the x-axis scale numbers. Well, we said our period was just 1 this time, so at the end of the x-axis, or at the end of the midline, depending on what's more convenient for you to do, I'm going to label that 1, the period's 1, but then remember I need the halfway point, that's easy, it's just a half this time, and then half of the halfway point, or a quarter, and then this point as well for 3/4. I want to make sure all of those points are identified. And now to finish this one, we need to follow our cosine wave pattern to get our points plotted. But remember, this graph has been reflected. So as while we're used to cosine beginning from the highest point, now we're flipped around. And so my cosine is going to begin from the low point, the minimum. So down here. At the next stop along the x-axis, my cosine is now at the midline, not at the x-axis, but at the midline. From there, the cosine is going to go to the high point, the maximum, so we're up here. Back to the midline, and then we're going to end where we started down here at the minimum value. So once you get a couple points plotted, most people don't have a problem. But remember, we were reflected this time. That's why we're following the pattern backwards. So I'll go ahead and draw that cosine wave in there. Try not to draw over your numbers. If you need to stop your line a little bit, that's fine. And then I'm going to continue that curve again, pointing upwards a little bit. So I just have a reminder that this graph does continue forever in both directions following that wave. But there are 2 periods drawn of each of these graphs. So if you have questions, go ahead and ask me in class. Otherwise, I hope that this helped.